Hey, this is Caitlin with Bagot Simplicity. I thank you for being here today. This is our lesson 2 in our study on Biblical Womanhood from Titus 2, 3 through 5. And not only Titus 2, 3 through 5, but really the whole book. But right now we're just in Titus 2, verse 4. In our last video, we talked about loving our husbands, but today we're talking about how to love our children. And I want to start by saying that there is nothing that'll make you realize that you need growth in being a godly woman, a Christian woman, a biblical woman, like doing a study like this. And those of you that don't know me that are watching this video, my girls in my class know me well enough to know this, and I've told them multiple times. But those that don't know me, I am not perfect. And as I'm going through these lessons, I am talking to myself that I am not perfect in these things. I've got so many areas to grow in. And I love doing studies like this because they help me to grow. And that's why I do them. So I enjoy them. So today we are doing lesson 2, and it is entitled To Love Your Children and How to Love Your Children. And you remember in Titus 2 that it says there in verse 4, and so train the young women to love their husbands and children. So there, that Greek word for love is connected not only to husbands, but also to our children. It's the same word. So we're going to briefly go over the definition there, and then we're going to talk about 2 points on loving our children. And the first being showing them affection. How to show them affection. We'll briefly go over the 5 love languages again and how they relate to children. So give a few examples for each one and how they relate to children. And then secondly, involved in loving your children is discipline. And there's scripture over and over again that talks about that. So we're going to look at that as well. And then the lesson will be yours. So let's start with that Greek word for love again. Let's go over that quickly. The Greek word for love here in Titus 2 verse 4 is philandros. And philandros here means affection, to show affection, to be fond of. And we talked about last week how this is showing affection because it's God's will. Not because someone is being lovable and therefore I show them love back. This is showing affection because it's God's will despite them maybe not being lovable all the time. Because we are not always lovable. Our husband is not always lovable, and our children are not always lovable. So the love here is affection towards our husbands. And something I didn't mention last week that's also important is that, there's verses all throughout the Bible that tell us to love mankind. But this verse here, the older women are specifically to teach the younger women to love their man, to love their children. Not everybody else is here. This is specifically talking about loving your own husband and loving your own children. Sometimes we have more patience and are not as quick to anger with those outside of our home, everybody else's spouse and everybody else's children. But when it comes to within our 4 walls, we lose our patience much quicker with our own children and our own husband, or get angry quicker with our own children and our own husband. So if you're like me and you do that, you see why Paul was telling Titus to tell the older women, you need to teach the young women these things. You need to teach them how to love their own husband and their own children. So I want you to keep that in mind as we're going through this, thinking of one day your own husband if you're not married, and your own children if you don't have children already, future children. So keep that in mind. All right. So what does it mean to love your own children? Let's first look at our first point being affection, showing them affection. It is important, it is imperative for our children to know that we love them, for them to know that we care about them. We can show them love by speaking their love language. And we talked about the 5 love languages that Dr. Gary Chapman's come up with last week. And they can apply to children as well. They are physical touch, words of affirmation, acts of service, quality time, and gifts. Those 5 love languages not only can apply to your spouse, but they can apply to your children. So it's important to learn your child's love language and then speak their love language to them in order to fill their love tank quickly. And we must do that, especially when you're having days where they're being disobedient and you're having to discipline them more. You need to be even more so on your game of speaking their love language. They need to know that those two things go hand in hand, that I'm disciplining you because I love you and I show you affection despite you not being lovable all the time. Your children need to know that. So let's look quickly at these 5 love languages and see how we can apply them to our children. The first one let's talk about is quality time. You can show your child, say your child's love language is quality time. I'm going to give some examples for each one of these real quickly. Quality time, play with them. One-on-one, at their level, talking to them, playing with them. That's an example of spending quality time with your child. The second one, words of affirmation. This is giving your child positive reinforcement. Thank you for taking care of that, Morgan. Thank you for putting that up. Thank you for picking up your toys without me telling you. Thank you for flushing the toilet. You look so handsome. You did such a good job brushing your own hair. You did such a good job getting dressed by yourself. That's words of affirmation. The next one, gifts. For children, this doesn't mean every time you go to Walmart, you get them something. That's not what this is. I say this is when you are giving that positive reinforcement to your child. It could be you have a really good day homeschooling and you let them pick a piece of candy out of your candy box or whatever you have. It could be that they get to watch a TV show that day because they've been so well behaved. It could be anything like that. It doesn't have to just be something from the store. It can be screen time. It can be some privilege that they get to do. The next one, physical touch. This is giving that baby some hugs, giving them some kisses. They want to, my son oftentimes at night, Mama, just lay with me. I'll take the time and I'll lay down by him and tickle his back. That's showing him love and affection that he needs. Next is acts of service. This one can be tricky for me, and I think this is one of my son's main love languages because he'll start asking me to do things that he can do, like putting his shoes on, or brushing his hair, or helping him put his clothes on. These are things he knows how to do at the age of 4. He knows how to do these things, but I think this is one of his love languages because when he's asking me to do those things, he's asking me to show him love. Even though I know he can put his shoes on, I know he can get dressed by himself, and I don't always do those things for him, even when he asks, because it's hard to know if that's laziness or wanting love sometimes, but it's doing things like that for them when they don't want to have to do them themselves. It's helping them pick up their toys sometimes, even though they made the entire mess, but it's showing them that love and helping them sometimes. That's acts of service, showing acts of service to your child. So those are ways to show affection to your children by using those 5 love languages that we also talked about with loving our husbands. Now, secondly, that I'm going to spend most of my time on is discipline. That we also show our children we love them by disciplining them properly. First, let's start with looking at several passages in Scripture because God talks about the importance of discipline, not just towards children, but discipline in general. And God is the perfect example of being a parent. You look back in the Old Testament with the children of Israel and God as their father, he disciplined them at times, but he also took great care of them, and disciplining them helped them to grow at times. And he does the same thing with us as Christians. He takes care of us, and sometimes we need to be disciplined. We need to be taught things more clearly, and parents need to do that with your children. Have loving discipline towards them. Let's start in Revelation 3:19 and look at that quickly. I'll read it aloud. Those whom I love, I reprove and discipline. So be zealous and repent. Behold, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come in to him and eat with him, and he with me. Now, this is Jesus when he is judging the 7 churches of Asia. And he does discipline. He's talking about disciplining them, and God does discipline. And it helps us to grow here, and he does that. Why does he do it? Why does he discipline us? What does it say here? Those whom I love, I reprove and discipline. Isn't that why I discipline my son? I discipline my son because I love him, and I want him to grow. I want him to grow in holiness, and I want him to be obedient and kind and loving. That's why I discipline him. Let's also look at Hebrews chapter 12, verses 10 through 11. Hebrews chapter 12, verses 10 through 11. For they disciplined us for a short time as it seemed best to them, but he, being God, disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment all discipline seems painful rather than pleasant, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness to those who have been trained by it. And you know, with your child, when they know they're about to get a spanking or about to be put in the corner to have some time by themselves, I call it isolation time, they don't enjoy it. Discipline isn't meant to be enjoyed. It's meant to teach a lesson. It's meant to draw us closer to God. And that's what the writer of Hebrews is saying here. It's meant for our good. And like I said with Revelation 3:19, this is why we discipline as parents. We discipline for our children's good, to teach them, to draw them closer to God, to teach them to be holy and kind and loving. So those are the why behind we discipline. And some verses in Proverbs, I want you to turn to Proverbs 22:15. Proverbs 22:15 gives us some more why, but specifically why we discipline children. Just not, the past verses have been discipline in general, but why do we discipline children? Look at Proverbs 22:15. Folly is bound up in the heart of a child, but the rod of discipline drives it far from him. So in teaching a child and disciplining a child and training them, you're helping them in their future. You're helping them gain wisdom and knowledge and understanding, and getting rid of some of those folly and selfish ways sometimes. Also look in this regard to Proverbs 29, verse 17. Proverbs is filled with scripture on disciplining children, and the rest of our verses are going to be from Proverbs. Proverbs 29:17, because they are just good little tidbits of wisdom. Discipline your son, and he will give you rest. He will give delight to your heart. I know as a young parent with a young child that I look forward to the day where the training me and my husband have done, the disciplining we have done pays off, where we have that time of rest. You think about working with your child on behaving in the church building during worship. That one day I'm not going to have to get up and go out with him all the time, or I'm not going to have to keep quietly reminding him, this is time to worship, we have to be quiet, look at your Bible book, whatever it is. There's going to be a day that I have that rest, that my husband and I have that rest, because all that training will pay off that we're doing now. So that's an encouraging verse to look to when you're in the trenches of parenting on bad days, when your child's just having a hard time and you're having a hard time. It's important to remember those things, that what I'm doing, remember the purpose of why you're doing it. I'm doing this out of love. I'm doing this because I want my child to grow closer to God. And I'm doing this because it's going to help my child. I'm not doing these things out of anger. And if you are, you have to work on that. It might be you have to step away for a minute and get a hold on your own emotions before you discipline your child. It's important to remember it's not all about you. It's not about you at all. It's about teaching your child about God and teaching them to grow closer to God. So that's important to remember. Look at Ephesians chapter 6, verse 4. This section, verses 1 through 4, is all about children and parents, but we're going to look specifically at verse 4. Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. That's our basis of discipline. We are bringing them up in the discipline and instruction of God. So all of our discipline goes back to Scripture, goes back to God. We want to build godly characteristics in our children. We want to teach them to be kind, to not be a bully, to be loving, to be a servant. All these things that we start when they are so young, and then it just gets easier and easier for them. You're building these habits from such a young age that it just becomes a part of them. So that's a beautiful thing. So train them and discipline them in the Lord. Discipline in general brings knowledge, wisdom, and life. You can write down these verses. Proverbs 12:1, Proverbs 13:24, and Proverbs 10:17 are very general verses about what discipline brings. It brings knowledge. Proverbs 12 verse 1, I believe that's the one that goes with it. It brings wisdom, Proverbs 13:24, and it brings life, Proverbs 10 verse 17. So discipline is not a bad thing. A lot in the world, you can view it as a bad thing because, like we read earlier, it's not something that we enjoy at first, but years later you're grateful for it, kind of thing. But discipline is not a bad thing. Discipline is not abuse either, though. So I want to bring that out, that there is a line drawn on discipline. This is not beating your child. This is training them with a purpose behind it. This is not bruising your child, making your child bleed, or hitting them in the face or anything like that. That is not godly discipline. That's abuse. So that is not what I'm talking about when I'm talking about discipline. But when I'm reading these next verses, when it talks about beating your child with a rod, it is not like what we might initially think of beating them to a bloody pulp. That's abuse. That's not what God is talking about here. But disciplining or training our children is a Bible concept, like you've already seen in all these verses and what you're going to see in the next several verses. It is a Bible topic that we need to heed to as God's people. And in loving our children, we have to discipline them in love. So let's look at some more Proverbs on what it means to love our children through disciplining them. Turn to Proverbs 13:24. Proverbs 13:24. Whoever spares the rod hates his son, but he who loves him is diligent to discipline him. Diligent to discipline him. When I read that, I think about consistency, which is one of the hardest things for me, is to be consistent in my training with my child. Sometimes you'll let things slide, and that's not consistent discipline. From this verse, you can also get the idea of the need to start early. And I'm not saying right out of the womb necessarily, but starting your child early on creating good habits for them, creating good characteristics in them, some godly characteristics in them. Teaching them not to touch things. That's one of those things that's for their own good sometimes. That might be, when they're really little, you barely pop them on the hand. It's not something that hurts them necessarily, but it's something that gets their attention. So a little pop on the hand. If they're trying to crawl up the steps and that's dangerous, you pop them on the hand. Whether you choose to use a little spanking stick or whatever you want to call it, but that's disciplining them out of love because you don't want them to get hurt, or there's just certain things they don't need to touch. So that's a disciplining there that you can start early with. You don't wait until they're 5 or wait until they're 9 to start disciplining them. This starts early. The next verse is Proverbs 22:6. Turn to Proverbs 22:6. I'm sorry, I'm sniffly. My allergies are acting up, so you'll hear me sniffle a lot. Proverbs 22:6. Train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. This is that concept of training that I love. This training is to instruct by exercising. I am giving opportunities to train my son. I am putting things out when he's really little. I was putting things out that I knew he would want to grab, but he knows he's not supposed to grab. I wear glasses. Putting my glasses down, and children for some reason have a fascination with glasses, especially when they're on your face. So we started early training him. You don't pull mama's glasses. You don't pull mama's hair and things like that. And he would get a little pop on the hand just to get his attention. It wasn't something that made him cry, unless you have a very tender-hearted child. My son was not. He just kind of looked at you like, and he tried again, and then you pop him again until he realizes, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. So it's things like that, putting things in front of them. Those are training exercises in teaching your child and disciplining your child. But training here is also, let me find my notes. It means here to touch the palate or taste. And training is meant to cause a thirst for God. I train my child, and you think about God is our authority as Christians, and parents are children's authority. Well, where do they learn the concept of authority? They learn it from parents, and then therefore if they have a proper regard for parents' authority, they'll have a proper regard and thirst for God's authority. So that's another reason it's so important to train and discipline your child, so they understand the authority of God. They understand the authority of you as the parent, and it'll be so much easier for them to understand the authority of God. Look at Proverbs 23:13 through 17. Proverbs 23:13 through 17. Do not withhold discipline from a child. If you strike him with a rod, he will not die. If you strike him with the rod, you will save his soul from Sheol. And I should have said verses 13 through 14, not 17. Proverbs 23:13 through 14 there. Disciplining here, as it says, it saves their soul. Again, remember why we discipline. We discipline so that our children learn how to follow Christ. They get that thirst for Christ, and to one day go to heaven. We discipline them to save their soul. We discipline them so they can gain knowledge and wisdom and life. That's saving their soul. So that's why we discipline. It's important, and sometimes I don't remember that. I'm just in the moment of my son is doing something he should not do, and I take it personally. Or I'm embarrassed by the way my son is acting. That should not be my push to discipline my son. My push to discipline my son should be out of love to save his soul, to teach him, to draw him closer to Christ. That should be my purpose behind disciplining. Like I said, not because I'm embarrassed by the way he's acting out in public, or I'm angry because he's doing this against me, which it's not all about me. But it's important as a parent to remember why you're disciplining, and that what you should be remembering is you're doing this to draw them closer to God and to save their soul, to one day get them to heaven. Look at Proverbs 29, verse 15. Proverbs 29:15. The rod and reproof give wisdom. There it is again. The rod and reproof give wisdom. I've lost my place completely. Let's see. but a child left to himself brings shame to his mother. So having discipline, giving our child discipline, helps that child gain wisdom, and it protects them from danger. That's important, and we talked about that a little bit. Discipline, we do those things because we want to protect our son or our daughter. And discipline can look different for different people and different children, because every child is different. I only have one son, and those in my class know that. I only have Morgan. But just being around other children and other people's children, I've seen families, large families, and every child is so different. Every one of them so different. And sometimes different personalities require different discipline. Spanking does not work with every child. There are some children that, I'm not saying you would do this, but you can beat them till they're black and blue. You could abuse them and they still wouldn't do what you wanted them to do. Spanking is not what gets across to them. Sometimes, other than spanking, like I said, I call it isolation. This is where your child doesn't get to participate in whatever's going on. And to some children, that is so much worse than getting a spanking. That is what teaches them the lesson. They have to go sit in a corner and face the corner, and they cannot turn around and they cannot get out until you tell them you can. You can set a timer, whatever it is, but that works for some children better than spanking. Some children, taking certain things away from them, certain privileges, them not getting read to that night because they disobeyed in some way, or them not getting to go to a certain event because of their disobedience. That speaks to some children. And some children, you could use all of these things. I don't do just one. Me and my husband don't use just one for Morgan. It depends on the situation and what works for him at that moment. Also, and like I said, all these different things work for different children, and sometimes you can use all of them with one child. It's just all about what works and what gets the lesson across to your child on what you're wanting them to do, what you're trying to teach them here, what you're training them to do, the outcome you're wanting, whatever it gets across. You know, there's time you need to explain why they're in trouble. Explain to them, and I'm not saying lecture them for an hour, especially little ones, they don't get that. But letting them know, I'm spanking you because you were talking ugly to mom. I'm spanking you because you were being a bully to the dogs, or being a bully to your brother or sister. You explain why you're putting them in isolation corner. You explain why you're spanking them, or why they're not getting to do this privilege. Let them know the behavior that is negative, and give them examples of what you want them to do. You know, ask them the question, how should you have said that to mom? How should you have treated your sister? How should you have been acting towards the dogs instead of hitting them? Let them answer that. Give them an example of what you're wanting, what the behavior you're wanting from them. That's training. That is teaching them how to be holy, how to be godly. That's what you're wanting to do. It's not just stopping the behavior. What you're wanting to do, you do want to stop that behavior, but that's not the reasoning behind what you're doing. The reasoning behind discipline is to draw them to Christ, like we said. And I can't say that enough. The reason why we discipline and train our children, and we do it because we love them, but we want them to grow closer to Christ, be a follower of Christ one day, and to go to heaven. That's why we do what we do. So it's so important. Show your child affection first. And when you're having to have one of those days, which you will have them, where you're having to discipline because they're just being disobedient over and over and over again, those are the days you really need to lay it out with the affection. You know, you speak their love language over and over again to balance out that discipline, so they know that you love them. Because when they're little, they don't understand that discipline is love. Like we read, I believe in Hebrews, that it's for their good. They don't understand that all the time when they're really little. So you tell them over and over again, I love you. You tell them over and over again why you're doing this. You show them acts of service. You give them quality time. You tell them words of affirmation. You give them positive reinforcement with gifts. You do all these things and show them affection because you love them. And secondly, you show them and give them discipline because you love them. God disciplines us because he loves us. He disciplines those he loves. And we discipline as parents because we love them. And we talked about all these verses on discipline and what that means, and how important it is to help them to grow in knowledge and understanding and wisdom and in life in general. So my prayer is that we can love our children by showing them affection and disciplining them, and therefore teach them, give them that thirst for Christ, draw them closer to God, and therefore be with them in heaven one day. So I thank you for being here. The girls in my class, I'm going to be group texting you some questions, so after you watch this, you can answer some questions for me. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a fantastic day.